So I want you to picture the docks of Liverpool, England. It's the late 1890s.
Right, the height of the Victorian era.
Exactly. It's cold, it's raining, the air is just thick with that heavy coal smoke. And there's this young shipping clerk standing on the cobblestones.
Morel.
Right. And he's just staring at a ledger. He works for the Elder Dempster shipping line, which they held a total monopoly on the route between Europe and Central Africa at the time.
Yeah, a massive, massive company.
So this clerk, he's watching these huge cargo ships arrive from the Congo, and they are riding incredibly low in the water. I mean, their hulls are just bursting with thousands of tons of ivory and increasingly this wildly valuable rubber.
Right, the wealth pouring onto those specific docks is just astronomical.
It's insane. But then he stays on the docks and he watches those exact same ships being loaded up for the return journey back to Africa. And I mean, in a normal, healthy trading relationship, those outbound ships would be filled with goods, right?
Sure, yeah. Things to pay the people extracting all that wealth.
Yeah.
Like textiles, tools, currency.
Exactly. But they aren't. He's looking at the cargo going onto the ships, and they're filled almost entirely with rifles. Massive crates of ammunition, iron chains, manacles.
Wow. Yeah, that moment on the docks, it's one of the most chilling epiphanies in modern history, really.
He really is.
Because that clerk, he wasn't looking at some standard trade deficit, but just looking at those columns and numbers, rubber coming in, chains going out. He realized he was looking at the financial blueprint of a massive militarized slave state.
Yeah, it was all right there in the math.
Exactly. The ledger proved that millions of people, thousands of miles away, were not being paid for their labor. They were being forced to extract this wealth at gunpoint.
And that realization just completely shatters the illusion of what the whole world thought was happening in Central Africa at the time.
It really does.
So, to you listening right now, we know the kind of historical deep dives you appreciate. You're the kind of learner who doesn't just want, like, a dry list of dates or some sanitized textbook summary.
Right, you want the mechanics.
You want to understand how massive, complex systems of power are actually built. And crucially, how they hide in plain sight. You want the how and the why behind the darkest chapters of history, but, without drowning in a sea of academic jargon.
Which brings us to the core mission of today's deep dive. We are examining the architecture of evil in the Congo Free State. This is from 1885 to 1908.
Under the absolute personal rule of King Leopold II of Belgium.
Yeah. And the stack of sources we're synthesizing today is, well, it's incredibly dense and just profoundly disturbing.
Very heavy stuff today.
We were working through primary diplomatic records from the 19th century, historical analyses of the era known as the Red Rubber Terror, and the original dispatches from the world's very first human rights whistleblowers.
And we also have some cutting-edge econometric studies that actually measure the literal generational scars this regime left on the descendants of the survivors.
Right. So our goal today is to move way beyond the horrific statistics. I mean, imperialism in the late 19th century was inherently brutal across the board.
Oh, absolutely. It was extractive everywhere.
But the Congo Free State represents this very unique anomaly. This is a profound case study of how a single individual, a monarch, who is acting not on behalf of his nation, but as a private citizen, how he transformed an entire massive territory into a private, profit-driven labor camp.
Yeah, it's mind-blowing. We really have to understand the psychological roots of this exploitation and the bureaucratic systems that, normalize the terror.
We want to challenge you to reflect on historical accountability and how the invisible supply chains of the past really mirror the ones we rely on today.
Okay, let's unpack this, because if we are talking about a single private citizen acquiring a landmass that is roughly the size of Western Europe, the very first historical hurdle we hit is just the legality of it.
Right, the paperwork.
Yeah. How does an individual legally convince the entire geopolitical establishment to just hand him a private continent?
Well, it requires a grand deception, a massive con. And to understand that deception, we have to rewind to long before Leopold II ever became the king of the Belgians in 1865.
We have to look at his psychology.
Exactly. We're looking at a man who was consumed by this profound sense of geopolitical inadequacy.
Yeah, he was the heir to a very small, very young nation. Belgium had only won its independence in 1830.
Right. It was a constitutionally bound monarchy, and it was wedged between these massive imperial powers. France, Germany, Great Britain.
They were surrounded by giants.
And Leopold felt completely suffocated by his nation's neutrality and its small physical footprint. He traveled a lot in his youth. to Egypt, to India, to the Mediterranean, and he saw the insane wealth that colonial empires were extracting.
He saw the British in India and was like, I want that.
Basically, yeah, he developed this singular, obsessive ambition to be a builder king. He really believed that for Belgium to survive and be taken seriously on the world stage, it desperately needed an empire.
But, and this is the crazy part, the Belgian government, like the actual democratically elected parliament, wanted absolutely nothing to do with the colony.
Nothing at all.
They looked at the British or the French and just saw endless military quagmires, administrative black holes, just massive drains on the national treasury.
They viewed imperialism as a catastrophic financial liability.
Right. And there's this deeply telling anecdote from 1860 when Leopold was still just the Duke of Brabant. He was so frustrated with the anti-colonial stance of his own Belgian finance minister, this guy named Walther Orban, that he actually gave the minister a custom-made paperweight.
A paperweight.
A paperweight. It was a piece of solid marble, and engraved on it were the words, Il faut à la Belgique une colonie. Belgium needs a colony.
Wow. That is just the ultimate passive-aggressive political gesture.
Truly. And the finance minister, of course, just ignored the paperweight. The Belgian political elite repeatedly shut down Leopold's imperial ambitions.
So Leopold realizes pretty quickly that if his own government isn't going to conquer a territory for him, he's simply going to have to acquire one for himself.
He's going rogue.
He bypasses the Belgian state entirely. And he achieves this through, honestly, a masterpiece of diplomatic camouflage. In the 1870s, he starts floating this idea of a grand international scientific and humanitarian mission in Central Africa.
So he essentially sets up a network of front organization.
Exactly. The most prominent one was the International African Association, which he founded in 1876.
Right. And he hosts these lavish geographical conferences in Brussels. He's inviting famous explorers, scientists, philanthropists. It looks incredibly legitimate.
Very high society. He hires the legendary, albeit incredibly ruthless explorer Henry Morton Stanley to map the Congo River basin and establish these initial outposts.
And Leopold frames every single dollar he spends not as a land grab, but as this noble philanthropic crusade.
Yeah.
The stated goals, publicly, were to map the uncharted interior, bring Western medical science to the region,
and most importantly, to eradicate the brutal East African Arab slave trade that was ravaging the eastern borders of the Congo at the time.
Right. The propaganda was just flawless. He positions himself as this benevolent humanitarian stepping in where actual governments feared to tread.
And he also weaponizes the intense paranoia of the European superpowers against each other.
Right, because this is the dawn of the scramble for Africa.
Exactly. Great Britain, France, and the newly unified Germany under Otto von Bismarck, they are all intensely suspicious of each other's territorial ambitions.
France feared British dominance. Britain feared French protectionism, shutting down free trade.
And Bismarck just wanted to keep France and Britain totally distracted in Africa so they wouldn't focus on European borders.
It's a powder keg of imperial anxiety. So Leopold just steps right into the middle of this and offers a brilliantly manipulative solution.
He basically says to the superpowers, look, don't fight a world war over this massive piece of land in the center of the continent. Give it to my humanitarian society.
Let me handle it.
Right. He promises to run it as a neutral free trade zone. No tariffs, no military buildup, just open commerce and philanthropy for the good of all mankind.
And somehow, they buy it. At the Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885, which, by the way, is a completely surreal historical event.
Oh, totally.
You have these European diplomats literally sitting around a giant map of Africa, just carving up a continent, completely ignoring the fact that the vast majority of it is already governed by complex indigenous societies.
Yeah, the arrogance is astounding. But the powers agreed to Leopold's proposal. Bismarck, who personally found Leopold incredibly annoying,
but politically useful.
Right, exactly. He championed the idea just to maintain a buffer zone between the rival empires. And the United States, swayed by Leopold's intense lobbying and the promise of free trade, had actually already become the first nation to recognize his claim.
Which gives birth to the ultimate geopolitical irony, the Congo Free State. It's recognized internationally in 1885. But it was free only in the sense that it belonged to no single European nation.
Right, it was just a free trade zone for European capital.
But in reality, it was the sole private property of King Leopold II. He was the quote-unquote king sovereign. He had no parliament to answer to there, no constitution limiting his power, and zero oversight.
If we translate this into a scenario that resonates today, it's just wild to think about. Imagine a modern tech billionaire standing up before the United Nations.
Okay.
And they announced they're establishing a massive charitable foundation to bring, say, high-speed internet, clean water, and democratic infrastructure to a vast developing region.
Sounds great on paper.
Right, the international community applauds. They sign off on the initiative, and they actually grant this billionaire total legal sovereignty over the territory, supposedly to bypass bureaucratic red tape.
And the second the ink dries on that UN resolution.
That billionaire locks the borders, outlaws all other businesses, and turns the entire landmass into an unregulated, private corporate fiefdom, where the citizens are legally classified as the property of the company.
That is insane, but that is the exact scale and audacity of the con that Leopold pulled off.
It really is.
But here's the thing. Maintaining a philanthropic facade over a territory that is 76 times larger than Belgium, that is catastrophically expensive.
Oh, incredibly. Mapping a dense rainforest, building steamboats, establishing outposts, paying an entire army of explorers, it drained Leopold's massive personal fortune really fast.
Yeah, by the late 1880s, the King Sovereign was dangerously close to personal bankruptcy. He even had to go beg the Belgian government for these massive loans just to keep his private venture afloat.
Which, pretty embarrassing considering the paperweight incident.
Seriously.
Bad.
So initially, the Free State tried to extract ivory, and while ivory was a luxury commodity, it was finite, and it required really skilled hunters.
It wasn't yielding the kind of astronomical returns he needed to pay off those mounting debts, let alone fund his grand architectural dreams back in Brussels.
He needed an economic miracle.
And that miracle arrived from a completely unexpected source. A Scottish veterinarian living in Belfast named John Boyd Dunlop.
Ah, Dunlop tires.
Exactly. In 1887, Dunlop was just trying to make his son's tricycle more comfortable to ride on the cobbled streets, so he invents the inflatable pneumatic rubber tire.
And that just changes everything.
Almost immediately, a massive bicycle craze sweeps across Europe and North America. And shortly after that, the early automobile industry begins to take off.
So the global industrial demand for rubber goes from the slow, steady trickle, for things like waterproof boots and hoses to an absolute insatiable explosion.
And Leopold looks at a botanical map of his private property and realizes he has essentially won the industrial lottery.
Because the Congo Basin was home to one of the largest natural reserves of wild rubber on the planet.
But he faced a massive logistical nightmare. The territory was staggeringly huge, covered in dense, inhospitable rainforest. The state administration was virtually non-existent at this point.
Right. I read that at one point there were only about 175 white administrative agents in charge of this entire massive operation.
Yeah, it's nothing. So how do you extract millions of tons of a raw material from a jungle with barely any staff and no infrastructure?
You fundamentally alter the legal definition of ownership.
Right.
In a series of these sweeping decrees in 1891 and 1892, Leopold declared that all, quote, unoccupied land in the Congo Free State was now the exclusive property of the state.
And we have to define what unoccupied meant in this context.
Right.
Because in the Congo, unoccupied meant any land that wasn't actively featuring a dwelling or a cultivated farm. So all those millions of square miles of dense forests, rivers, and savannas, suddenly state property.
And therefore, all the natural resources within those forests, specifically the wild rubber, belonged entirely to Leopold.
With the stroke of a pen in Europe, the indigenous populations were totally stripped of their ancestral land rights and their ability to trade independently.
But Leopold still needed a massive workforce to physically go into those forests and harvest the rubber, and he needed a management structure to oversee them.
Which he didn't have.
Right, he lacked the state capacity. So he invented the concession system. He carved up the most rubber-rich regions of the Congo into these massive blocks of land and just handed them over to private, profit-driven corporations.
The two most infamous and brutal ones being the Congo Company and the Anversois Trust.
And Leopold, demonstrating his absolute control here, retained a 50% ownership stake in these companies.
So he ensured he would pocket half the profits from every single ounce of rubber extracted while entirely outsourcing the dirty work of the actual management.
It's so calculating, and the way these concession borders were drawn is just an exercise in bureaucratic absurdity.
Because the interior was so thoroughly uncharted, right? The corporate executives in Brussels couldn't use traditional markers like mountain ranges or established ethnic boundaries to draw the maps.
They used river basins.
Yeah. The Eber concession, for example, was granted the entire Moringalapori River Basin, plus this arbitrary 25-kilometer buffer zone around the rivulets.
So these invisible lines drawn on a map in Europe arbitrarily sliced right through hundreds of distinct communities, cultures, and historic trade networks.
If your village happened to fall inside that river basin line, you were now legally required to pay a tax to the private concession company.
And because the companies had absolutely no interest in local currency, the tax had to be paid in labor. Specifically, a grueling, mathematically impossible quota of wild rubber.
We need to really vividly describe what this labor actually looked like, because when the average person hears harvesting rubber, they likely picture, a modern plantation in Southeast Asia.
Right, you picture neat, orderly rows of rubber trees, workers making a small, precise diagonal cut in the bark, and a little metal cup neatly catching the white latex as it drips out.
That is plantation rubber. The rubber in the Congo Free State was entirely different and exponentially more difficult to extract.
The Congo rubber came primarily from a wild, creeping vine.
Right, the Landolphia owarensis vine. These thick vines snaked their way hundreds of feet up into the dark canopy of the dense rainforest. You couldn't just walk up to them and tap them neatly.
No. The workers, who were being forced out of their villages and into the dangerous forest under threat of death, had to physically climb these massive jungle trees.
And they had to slash the thick vines with knives.
And the latex that bled out of those vines was highly caustic. It coagulated really rapidly, so it couldn't be neatly collected in buckets.
This part is so horrific. The workers had to smear the liquid latex directly onto their own bodies, onto their bare arms, their chests, their thighs.
They had to stand in the suffocating heat of the jungle, waiting for the sap to dry and congeal into a solid, rubbery mass.
And then, to remove it, they had to painstakingly scrape and peel this hardened rubber off their own skin, ripping out their body hair and often taking top layers of skin with it.
It was excruciating, deeply degrading work, and the quotas imposed by the companies were, as we said, mathematically impossible to sustain.
The system demanded approximately 4 kilograms of dried rubber per man every fortnight.
And because wet rubber loses half its weight when it dries, that meant finding and carrying 8 kilograms of wet latex.
Which is a massive amount when you're gathering it vine by vine. And as the vines near the villages were quickly overtapped and died, the men had to travel further and further into the hostile interior.
Soon, men were spending up to 20 or 25 days a month living deep in the dangerous forest, exposed to torrential rains, predators, tropical diseases, just desperately trying to meet a quota for a corporation they had literally never heard of.
This presents a glaring operational problem for the concession companies.
Yeah, to say the least.
You have an impossible quota. You have excruciatingly painful, life-threatening work. And you have a completely unwilling workforce who are receiving almost nothing in return.
Maybe a cheap brass wire, a handful of salt, or some useless trinket if they were lucky. Mostly, they were working solely to avoid being killed.
Right, so how do you force millions of people to participate in a system like that? You can't just send a strongly worded corporate memo.
No. When the Congolese inevitably realized these quotas were a death sentence, they simply stopped working. They abandoned their villages and hid.
And Leopold's corporate spreadsheets started showing a deficit.
And his solution wasn't to offer better pay or better conditions. His solution was to build a massive private mercenary army.
Which brings us to the militarization of the Congo and the primary enforcement mechanism of the terror, the force publique.
Established officially in 1888, the force publique was the military wing of Leopold's corporate state. By the late 1890s, it had exploded in size to over 19,000 soldiers, making it the most formidable military presence in Central Africa.
But let's clarify the demographics of this army, because there weren't 19,000 Belgian citizens marching through the rainforest.
Far from it. The officer corps, the commanders, the captains, the men actually writing the orders were exclusively white Europeans.
Many were regular Belgian military officers, seconded to the Free State. But Leopold also actively recruited mercenaries from all across Europe. Swedes, Italians, Danes, men looking for rapid promotion, high-hazard pay, and the unchecked power of a colonial frontier.
But the rank-and-file soldiers, however, were entirely African.
Initially, to ensure loyalty, Leopold recruited heavily from outside the Congo, hiring Hausa fighters from West Africa or mercenaries from Zanzibar.
And the strategic logic there was brutal, right?
Extremely. Foreign soldiers shared no language, no culture, no kinship with the local Congolese populations, making them far more willing to enforce horrific violence without any hesitation.
But later, as the army needed to expand more rapidly, they began essentially kidnapping and conscripting locals, forcing them into uniform and training them to terrorize their own neighboring regions.
And the psychological warfare this army utilized is where the true, meticulously designed architecture of evil really reveals itself. If a village refused to collect rubber, the force public didn't just go in and arrest the men. They targeted the absolute most vulnerable point of any society. They utilized systemic hostage-taking.
The hostage system was the dark beating heart of the Red Rubber Terror.
The European officers and the corporate sentries quickly learned that hunting down men in the dense, familiar forest was nearly impossible. So a detachment of the force public would march into a village at dawn.
While the men fled or were overpowered, the soldiers would systematically kidnap the women, the children, and the elderly.
And they locked them in structures that were literally officially designated as hostage houses.
It's hard to even process that that was an official term.
These hostage houses were nightmares of human suffering. They were typically small, unventilated mud and thatch huts. Dozens of women and children were crammed inside with no sanitation, no clean water, and absolutely no food provided by the state.
The men of the village who were hiding in the forest would basically be told, if you ever want to see your families alive again, you will go back into the forest, find the rubber vines, and return with your full quota.
The psychological torment is unfathomable. Imagine wandering a hostile jungle, knowing that your child is starving to death or your wife is being subjected to systemic sexual violence by the sentries guarding the camp.
And your only currency to save them is a bucket of dried tree sap.
It broke the will of the population. It entirely shattered the social fabric of the society.
But what if a man couldn't find enough rubber? Because eventually the vines ran out. What happened when the quotas were missed?
The punishments were codified and completely draconian. The most common tool of terror was an instrument called the chicote.
This wasn't just a standard leather whip either.
No, the chicote was carved from sun-dried hippopotamus hide. It was essentially a solid rod of incredibly dense organic material, and it was carved to have these sharp, corkscrewed edges along its length.
It was explicitly designed to slice through flesh and muscle.
The standard punishment for falling short on a rubber quota was anywhere from 25 to 100 lashes. To give you context for the physical devastation this caused, 25 lashes from a chicote would strip the skin from a victim's back and buttocks.
And it routinely rendered them unconscious from the pain.
50 lashes would expose bone. 100 lashes were almost universally a death sentence, either from shock, blood loss, or subsequent infection.
It is wholesale, industrial-scale barbarity. And yet, there is one visual symbol of the Congo Free State that is more enduring and somehow even more chilling than the hostage camps or the hippo hide whips.
It's the baskets of severed hands.
Yeah. The severed right hand has become the defining historical shorthand for the atrocities of King Leopold's regime.
But to truly grasp why this happened, we have to look past the sheer sadism and examine the cold, bureaucratic accounting logic behind it. It wasn't just arbitrary torture. It was a corporate ledger written in human tissue.
Right, because the force public was heavily armed, and the weapons they used are the key to understanding this horrific practice.
Exactly. The standard issue weapon for the force public was the Albini Brandlin rifle. This was a single-shot, breech-loading rifle that fired a massive 11mm caliber bullet.
And the crucial detail here is that unlike older muskets that used cheap, locally made gunpowder and lead balls, the Albini rifle required expensive, precision-manufactured brass cartridges.
Cartridges that had to be imported all the way from Europe. The white European officers were incredibly stingy with this ammunition.
And they were deeply paranoid.
Very. They constantly feared that their African conscripts would waste the valuable imported bullets on hunting local game for meat. Or, far more terrifying to the officers, that the soldiers would secretly stockpile the brass cartridges to eventually stage a mutiny.
So the officers implemented an accounting mechanism to track every single bullet.
They created a terrifying rule. For every single brass cartridge fired, a soldier had to produce undeniable proof that the bullet had been used for its authorized purpose.
Which was to kill a rebel or a shirker who was refusing to harvest rubber.
And the universally mandated proof was a severed right human hand. The soldiers were literally required to balance their ammunition ledgers.
In many patrols, there was even a specifically designated soldier whose sole job was the keeper of the hands.
He carried a specialized basket and was responsible for smoking the severed hands over a slow wood fire. This preserved them in the intense tropical heat so they wouldn't rot, before they could be presented to the European post commander at the end of a weeks-long patrol.
And then the commander would just sit at a desk, count the empty brass casings, count the smoke cans, and balance the books.
It's pure mechanized evil.
I have to pause here because this specific detail is the subject of intense historiographical debate, and I want to make sure we are absolutely clear on the mechanics.
Yeah.
When people hear about the severed hands, the immediate horrifying mental image is that overseers were punishing lazy workers by chopping off the hands of living people to force them to work faster.
Right.
Is that what the actual policy was? Did they systematically chop off the hands of the living?
It is a really vital distinction to make. According to deep historical analyses by scholars like David Van Raybroek, the official bureaucratic policy, the intent dictated by the officers, was strictly to account for the dead.
You shoot a rebel, you sever the hand of the corpse to prove the kill.
However, the reality on the ground mutated into something far more grotesque. If a soldier fired his Albini rifle at a monkey because he was starving, or if he shot at a fleeing villager and missed in the thick brush, that soldier now had a massive problem.
He had an empty brass casing and no corpse.
And the punishment for a soldier coming back with an unbalanced ledger was severe.
Incredibly severe. A soldier missing a hand to match a bullet could be flogged with the chakot or executed for suspected mutiny.
So to balance their own books and save their own lives, soldiers who had wasted ammunition absolutely did chop off the hands of living people.
They would raid a village, pin down whoever they could catch, very often the slowest members of the community, like small children or the elderly, and sever their right hand with a machete.
They would leave the victim bleeding in the dirt to survive as an amputee or die of infection, while the soldier took the hand back to satisfy the European officer's ledger.
So while some historians argue it wasn't a top-down policy to amputate the living as a motivational punishment, the strict ammunition accounting system directly incentivized and resulted in the widespread systematic mutilation of living human beings.
The hands literally ceased to be body parts and became a fiat currency.
They did. The horror compounded upon itself. Villages that were completely out of rubber vines, knowing that the sentries were coming to kill them for missing their quota, would sometimes preemptively attack neighboring, weaker villages.
They would murder the inhabitants, sever their hands, and bring baskets of human remains to the concession agents instead of rubber, praying that the currency of death would satisfy the corporate tax.
It was an entire society descending into a nightmare economy based on violence.
And the absolute darkest irony of this entire system, we actually have a recorded quote from King Leopold himself regarding the practice of severing hands.
And his objection to it has absolutely nothing to do with morality or human rights. His objection is purely economic.
Yes. When reports of the widespread mutilations eventually reached Leopold in Brussels, he was reportedly quite irritated. But his reasoning strips away every last shred of the philanthropic facade he had spent decades building.
He is recorded as saying, "Cut off hands, that's idiotic. I'd cut off all the rest of them, but not hands. That's the one thing I need in the Congo."
That quote is just staggering. It's the one thing I need. He viewed millions of complex, living human beings strictly as biological machinery designed solely to harvest his wealth.
And when an absolute ruler treats a population as expendable biological machines, the result is a demographic collapse so severe, so rapid, that historians and demographers are still struggling to categorize it over a century later.
The sheer, incomprehensible scale of the death toll is difficult to process. We must acknowledge the exact numbers are impossible to pin down because Leopold never conducted a census.
You don't count machinery.
Exactly. The first formal census wasn't taken until the Belgian state took over in 1924. However, modern demographers, anthropologists, and historians have engaged in exhaustive analyses.
They cross-reference local missionary records, tax receipts from the concession companies, oral traditions from indigenous elders,
and comparative demographic models. The estimates range from a highly conservative 1 million to 5 million, all the way up to a catastrophic 15 million people.
But the general historical consensus centers around the number 10 million.
Yes, roughly 10 million human beings dead. To put that in perspective, that represents approximately half of the entire population of the Congo region at that time.
Half of a nation erased in a span of just over 2 decades.
It's hard to wrap your head around.
I really want to sit with that number for a second because my immediate reaction is authentic disbelief. How does a mercenary army of only 19,000 soldiers operating in an area the size of Western Europe manage to kill 10 million people? It seems logistically impossible if we're just talking about executions.
And that is exactly the point. The 10 million didn't all die from the bullets of the Albini rifles. The violence was the catalyst, but the massive death toll was the result of a complex, systemic cascade of mortality.
Direct killings account for hundreds of thousands, certainly.
But the vast majority perished because the architecture of extraction completely dismantled the foundational elements of survival. Think back to the hostage system and the impossible labor quotas.
Right. Because the able-bodied men were forced to live in the forest for weeks on end, and the women were locked in squalid hostage camps, the traditional agricultural calendar completely collapsed.
Who's left to plant the crops? Who is left to harvest?
No one. Subsistence farming ceased to exist across massive swaths of the rubber zones. Fields lay fallow.
To make matters worse, the state demanded that local villages feed the thousands of forced public soldiers and porters passing through, which drained whatever meager food stores the communities had managed to hide.
This resulted in massive, widespread, man-made famines. Hundreds of thousands of people starved to death in their own homes.
And extreme malnutrition leads directly to a weakened population with no immune response. This opened the door for the next wave of death, disease.
And the ecology of the region play a huge role here, right? We're talking about epidemics on an apocalyptic scale.
Yes. The sheer exhaustion of the population, combined with forced migrations and soldiers moving rapidly between diverse regions, created a perfect incubator for epidemics. Smallpox and amoebic dysentery ravaged the weakened communities.
But the most devastating biological killer was African trypanosomiasis, commonly known as sleeping sickness.
And the mechanism of how this disease exploded is deeply tied to the terror. Sleeping sickness is transmitted by the tsetse fly. Before Leopold's arrival, indigenous communities managed the disease through generations of ecological knowledge.
They carefully cleared brush around their villages and water sources to eliminate the fly's habitat.
When the forced public arrived, villagers abandoned their cleared lands and fled deep into the dense swamps and untouched jungle to hide.
They literally fled right into the heart of the tsetse fly's natural habitat. The terror actively pushed them into biological danger zones.
Precisely. The social structure required to maintain the cleared land was broken. The epidemics that followed were staggering. In the year 1901 alone, it is estimated that 500,000 Congolese died from sleeping sickness.
And layered on top of the murder, the famine, and the epidemics, you have a plummeting birth rate.
Women were so profoundly malnourished, deeply traumatized, and physically exhausted that they simply ceased menstruating or could not carry pregnancies to term. The population wasn't just being actively destroyed, the biological capacity to replenish itself was severed.
Which brings us to a highly complex, fiercely debated question among historians and legal scholars. How do we label a demographic collapse of this magnitude?
It's a tough conversation.
It is. I want to ensure we analyze this with strict impartiality because the terminology used to describe the Congo Free State is still hotly contested today. Was this a genocide?
It is a debate that strikes at the very core of how international law intersects with historical memory. If we look at the strict legal definition established by the United Nations in the 1948 Genocide Convention, which was drafted largely in response to the Holocaust, a genocide specifically requires the intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group.
Intent is the operative legal hurdle there.
Yes. Prominent historians, most notably Adam Hochschild, who wrote the seminal book King Leopold's Ghost, argue that legally speaking, the Congo Free State does not fit the strict UN definition of genocide.
They argue this because Leopold's primary overriding intent was never the extermination of the Congolese people.
Exactly. His intent was maximum profit. He actually needed the Congolese alive. Dead men cannot harvest rubber.
The mass death, they argue, was a byproduct, an astronomically callous, utterly disregarded byproduct, but a byproduct nonetheless of an incredibly brutal system of forced labor.
The policy was exploitation, not extermination.
Yeah. But there is a strong counterargument from other scholars who say that focusing entirely on the specific legal definition of intent obscures the horrific reality of the outcome.
Interestingly, Raphael Lemkin, the Polish Jewish legal scholar who actually coined the word genocide in 1944, considered the Congo Free State to be a prime historical example of the term he invented.
Wow, really? The guy who invented the word used this as an example.
Yes. Lemkin and a cohort of modern scholars argue that when a state implements policies that systematically and predictably eliminate entire populations through forced labor, artificial starvation, and the intentional destruction of cultural and social structures, it qualifies as genocide.
Regardless of whether the ultimate motive was a bank account rather than racial purity.
Exactly. They argue that the destruction of the society wasn't an accident. It was an integral, accepted part of the business model.
It essentially boils down to a debate between the strict legal definition of intent versus the catastrophic reality of the systemic destruction.
And to impartially synthesize this debate, whether historians ultimately label it a genocide in the strict legal sense, or prefer terms like crimes against humanity, a holocaust of extraction, or a hecatomb, which is an ancient term meaning a great public sacrifice or a massive slaughter, the terminology debate doesn't diminish the historical horror.
No, it doesn't change what happened on the ground.
It remains one of the most catastrophic systematic slaughters driven by capitalist extraction and unchecked colonial power in human history. It proves that a leader does not need an explicit policy of racial extermination to wipe out half a population. A policy of absolute unregulated greed backed by military force achieves the exact same result.
Which naturally leads to the question, if 10 million people are dying, how did the rest of the world remain so ignorant for so long?
Because Leopold had constructed this masterful, multi-million franc propaganda machine. He was actively bribing prominent journalists, heavily lobbying European and American politicians, and constantly spinning this narrative of a glorious civilizing mission bringing light to the heart of darkness.
The interior of the Congo was effectively a closed, highly militarized black box. How did the truth finally escape?
We needed people willing to look past the propaganda. We needed whistleblowers.
And the whistleblowers who finally cracked Leopold's wall of silence came from incredibly diverse and unexpected backgrounds.
The very first major fracture in the narrative didn't come from a European diplomat. It came from an African-American man named George Washington Williams.
Williams is a profoundly underappreciated historical figure.
He really is. He was a veteran of the American Civil War, an ordained minister, a lawyer, and a pioneering historian. In 1890, his curiosity was piqued by Leopold's grand claims, and he traveled to the Congo Free State, expecting to see the philanthropic utopia that was being advertised in the American press.
And he didn't just stay in the coastal administrative capital either. He traveled extensively, navigating over 1,000 miles up the Congo River.
He did. And what he witnessed utterly appalled him. He didn't see schools or hospitals. He saw state-sponsored slave raiding, arbitrary executions, the horrific conditions of the porters, and the sheer casual cruelty of the European officers.
So he sat down and wrote an open letter addressed directly to King Leopold II.
It was a blistering, methodical indictment. He listed 12 specific, undeniable charges of deceit, fraud, and mass murder.
And crucially, in that 1890 letter, Williams used a specific phrase to describe what Leopold's government was doing. He called their actions crimes against humanity.
It is widely considered one of the very first documented uses of that exact phrase in the context of international human rights law.
Williams lit the initial match, but tragically he contracted tuberculosis on his journey back and died in England shortly after.
Without him there to defend his work, Leopold's massive PR machine went into overdrive, successfully smearing Williams's reputation and burying the letter for years.
The fire almost went out. It took another whistleblower, operating from a completely different angle, the man we met at the very beginning of this deep dive, to truly start the inferno. E.D. Morel.
We return to Morel on the docks of Liverpool. Morel is a fascinating study in how raw data can reveal a hidden atrocity. He wasn't a missionary, he wasn't an explorer, and he had never set foot in Africa.
But his ledger epiphany, realizing that the massive influx of rubber was being paid for with massive imports of military-grade weapons and chains, it changed his life.
Morel realized the Congo Free State was a militarized slave camp.
And Morel doesn't just write a letter. He dedicates his entire existence to tearing down Leopold. He quits his lucrative job at the shipping company. He founds his own newspaper, the West African Mail, and becomes this relentless, obsessive, investigative journalist.
He cultivates anonymous sources inside the Congo, disillusioned officers, missionaries who had been terrified into silence. And crucially, he finds a powerful ally embedded deep inside the British diplomatic establishment.
Roger Casement.
Yes. Casement was the official British consul operating in the Congo. Under mounting public pressure generated by Morel's relentless journalism, the British government, which had its own complex imperial motives, but was genuinely concerned by the rumors officially tasked Casement in 1903 to travel deep into the interior rubber zones and investigate the claims.
Casement actually went into the concession areas. He interviewed the survivors, he saw the refugees, the burned villages, and the mutilated bodies firsthand.
He spent months meticulously documenting the reality. And in 1904, he delivered the Casement report to the British Parliament.
It was a diplomatic bombshell. This wasn't an activist's fiery pamphlet or an American historian's op-ed. It was an official, highly detailed, dryly written government document that completely validated the absolute worst accusations against Leopold's regime.
It confirmed the widespread use of the chicote, the horrors of the hostage houses, and the systemic severing of hands.
Shortly after the report was published, Casement and Morel teamed up and officially founded the Congo Reform Association, or the CRA. It rapidly evolved into the first massive international grassroots human rights movement of the 20th century.
They mobilized everyone. They got celebrities involved.
Sure.
Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the famous creator of Sherlock Holmes, wrote a blistering book called The Crime of the Congo.
But here's where the strategy of the movement gets really innovative. The CRA realized that dense diplomatic reports and long speeches weren't enough to move the masses. People couldn't conceptualize the scale of the horror from words alone.
They needed undeniable proof that couldn't be spun by Leopold's PR men, and they found it in a brand new piece of consumer technology.
The Kodak Brownie camera.
George Eastman had just revolutionized photography, making the camera relatively portable and accessible, and Christian missionaries operating deep in the Congo, most notably a British woman named Alice Seeley Harris and her husband John, were armed with these early cameras.
They essentially became the frontline photojournalists of the atrocity. Alice Seeley Harris took some of the most haunting, visceral photographs ever recorded in the history of the medium.
The most famous image, and undoubtedly the most heartbreaking, is the photograph of a Congolese man named Nasala from the village of Wala.
It's a devastating photo.
The black and white photograph shows Nasala sitting on the wooden porch of the missionary compound. He is staring down at something small on the ground in front of him. His expression is one of profound, numb devastation.
And when your eyes adjust to the image, you realize what he is staring at. A severed human hand and a small severed human foot.
They belonged to his 5-year-old daughter, Bawali. The corporate sentries had attacked his village for missing a rubber quota. They murdered his wife and his daughter, cannibalized them, which was a horrific practice actively tolerated among some of the auxiliary mercenary units to strike terror, and left the hand and foot behind.
Nasala wrapped his daughter's remains in leaves and carried them for miles to the missionary compound as undeniable proof.
Alice Seeley Harris captured that moment of unfathomable grief on film.
Those images were explosive. The CRA took Harris's photographs and transferred them onto glass slides for magic lantern shows, which was the early 1900s equivalent of a massive PowerPoint presentation.
They toured cities across Britain, the United States, and Australia. They projected these massive, undeniable images of mutilated children and severed hands onto screens in crowded, gas-lit lecture halls. The public outrage was instantaneous and unprecedented.
The visual evidence completely outflanked Leopold's propaganda. Mark Twain, the great American satirist, was so deeply outraged by the photographs that he joined the movement and wrote a brilliant, scathing political pamphlet titled King Leopold's Soliloquy.
In it, Twain imagines Leopold pacing in his palace, talking to himself and raging against his critics. And Twain writes Leopold specifically cursing the camera. He writes to the king saying, "The incorruptible Kodak, the only witness I couldn't bribe."
It's incredible to think about how that dynamic mirrors our world today. Think about how many modern human rights abuses or instances of state violence only come to light because a bystander pulls out a smartphone and hits record.
Technology making the invisible undeniable, the unbribable witness.
It was the ultimate catalyst for change. The combination of Morel's unrelenting data-driven journalism, Casement's official diplomatic weight, the high-profile celebrity endorsements, and the visceral, undeniable shock of Harris's photographs created a tidal wave of international pressure.
By 1908, the position of the King Sovereign was entirely untenable. The geopolitical winds had shifted, and Leopold was completely isolated.
So, hearing this, you might expect the story to end with justice. The international community steps in, they arrest King Leopold, try him for his crimes against humanity, and return the sovereignty of the land to the Congolese people.
Right. I deeply wish that were the historical reality. But the end of the Congo Free State is not a story of justice or restitution. It is a story of a highly profitable, carefully negotiated, corporate exit strategy.
Infuriating.
In 1908, Leopold did not simply surrender the Congo. He was forced by international pressure to relinquish his personal control, yes, but he negotiated a complex treaty where he legally sold the Congo to the Belgian government.
He sold the country he had essentially stolen, exploited, and destroyed back to his own parliament.
Yes, the private Congo Free State was dissolved, and the massive territory became the Belgian Congo, an official state colony managed by the Belgian parliament. But the financial terms of the transfer were extraordinary.
Belgium assumed all of the massive debts of the Congo Free State, debts Leopold had incurred building the railways and infrastructure used for his exploitation.
Furthermore, the Belgian government agreed to pay 45.5 million francs to complete Leopold's pet architectural projects back home. And, as the ultimate insult to the millions dead, they paid Leopold a personal installment of 50 million francs as a mark of gratitude for his great sacrifices to the nation.
It's breathtakingly cynical. He walks away a billionaire. And he didn't leave the crime scene quietly either. He initiated a massive, systematic cover-up of the evidence.
A literal, state-sponsored burning of the books. In the days leading up to the official handover in August 1908, the massive furnaces near the King's Palace in Brussels burned for 8 straight days.
He ordered the systematic destruction of the entire state archive of the Congo Free State. Ledgers, orders from the force public, financial reports, letters from concession agents, all of it turned to ash.
He reportedly told an aide at the time, "I will give them my Congo, but they have no right to know what I did there." He wanted to erase the blueprint of his evil from the historical record.
But the legacy of that wealth was already cemented in stone across Belgium. Literally.
Yes, the astronomical profits of the Red Rubber Terror were actively laundered into the urban landscape of Europe. Leopold earned his desired nickname, the Builder King.
If you walk through Brussels or Antwerp today, you are walking through his architectural legacy. The massive, imposing triumphal arch in the Parc du Cinquantenaire, the lavish extensions to the Royal Palace in Laeken, the stunning royal greenhouses, the Antwerpen Central Railway Station.
All of this monumental architecture was heavily financed by the blood, the forced labor, and the severed hands of the Congo Free State.
And for decades, the Belgian national narrative completely bought into the sanitized myth he wanted to leave behind.
It's what modern historians refer to as the Great Amnesia. For nearly a century, the horrific reality of the Congo Free State was largely absent from Belgian school curriculums. The 10 million dead were erased.
Instead, grand statues went up across the country praising Leopold II as a visionary pioneer, a selfless colonial genius who brought civilization to Africa.
It is really only in the last few years, particularly catalyzed by the global reckoning with historical monuments in 2020, that Belgium has begun to officially confront this past. King Philip of Belgium recently expressed his deepest regrets for the acts of violence and cruelty committed during Leopold's reign, and some statues have been modified, contextualized, or removed.
But the amnesia was profound, intentional, and highly effective for generations.
Leopold dies in 1909, exactly 1 year after selling the Congo, an incredibly wealthy man.
The Belgian state takes over and rules the colony until it finally wins independence in 1960. But what about the legacy over there? Because you don't just erase a corporate system that wiped out half a population, destroyed the agricultural base, and weaponized local leadership, and expect everything to simply bounce back.
No, the scars of trauma don't just vanish when the flag changes.
What is the specific, enduring, physical, and economic imprint of this architecture of evil a century later?
To answer that, we have an incredibly illuminating, uniquely constructed piece of modern economic research. Economists Sarah Lowe's and Eduardo Montero recently published a study that essentially acts as a modern-day diagnostic scan of the long-term damage.
They realized that because the borders of the Ubbeer and Enversoy's rubber concessions were drawn so arbitrarily using those river basins we discussed earlier, and because those borders do not align with modern political boundaries, geography, or specific ethnic groups, they could use a highly specific econometric tool called a geographic regression discontinuity design.
For the listener who might not be an economist, let's break down how that tool works. Basically, a geographic regression discontinuity design looks at an arbitrary border. Imagine a straight line drawn across a single, uniform neighborhood.
Right.
If the houses on the left side of the line are suddenly subjected to a terrible policy for 15 years and the houses on the right side are spared, you could look at those houses 100 years later. Since the geography and the people were originally identical, any major differences today can be directly attributed to that specific policy.
That's what they did with the river basins.
Exactly. They compared villages located just inside the old 1890s concession borders with villages located just a few miles outside those borders. These are areas with identical ecology, identical pre-colonial cultures and languages.
But one side of the invisible line experienced the hyper-violent, indirect rule of the private rubber companies for 14 years, and the other side did not. Lowe's and Montero used massive sets of demographic and health survey data from the modern Democratic Republic of Congo from 2007 and 2014.
This is more than 100 years after the concession companies packed up and left.
And what did the data reveal?
The generational scars are vividly, statistically undeniable today. Individuals living in villages just inside the former rubber concessions have significantly worse life outcomes across almost every measurable metric compared to their immediate neighbors just outside.
They have, on average, 1.4 fewer years of education. They are 26% less wealthy in terms of household assets.
And crucially, the physiological health outcomes are permanently stunted. Children and women inside the former concessions have significantly lower height-to-age percentiles, which is a key biological indicator of long-term generational malnutrition and poor health infrastructure.
That is just staggering to process. 1.4 years of education and a quarter of your wealth erased, all because your great-great-grandparents happened to live on the wrong side of a river basin, drawn on a map by a corporate executive in Brussels in 1892.
It's sobering.
But as a learner, I have to ask, why? Why does it persist so stubbornly? The private rubber companies have been gone for a century. The Belgian colonial state is gone. The Mobutu dictatorship of the 20th century is gone. What is the actual mechanism transmitting this poverty through generations?
It comes down to a fascinating dynamic between institutions and culture, specifically the corrosive legacy of what historians call indirect rule. Think back to how the concession sentries operated on the ground. They didn't just terrorize individuals, they systematically dismantled and co-opted the local indigenous political structures.
Before Leopold, many Congolese societies had complex systems of chiefs and elders with built-in checks and balances.
But if a traditional lineage headman or village chief resisted the rubber quotas to protect his people, the sentries killed him or threw him in chains. They then replaced him with a compliant strongman, often an outsider, a mercenary, or a minor, power-hungry figure who was willing to ruthlessly enforce the brutal regime in exchange for power.
The Europeans gave these compliant, despotic chiefs official medals, essentially anointing them as the new, permanent, ruling lineages.
So the Europeans artificially selected for despotic, unaccountable local leaders, completely destroying the indigenous checks and balances.
Yes. And Lowe's and Montero's data shows that this institutional damage became permanent. Because those new leaders were backed by the guns of the state, they never had to answer to their people.
Today, in the modern villages inside the former concessions, the local village chiefs are 35% less likely to be elected democratically. They are much more likely to inherit the position through those hereditary ruling lineages established by the rubber companies over a century ago.
The bad institutions entrench themselves like a virus.
Precisely. And because these inherited chiefs are less accountable to their communities, they provide significantly fewer public goods. The data shows that chiefs inside the concessions do significantly less to maintain local roads, they mediate fewer community conflicts, and they invest far less effort in maintaining local schools or clinics.
The formal, local institutions were broken a century ago to serve a corporation, and they remain broken today, functioning more as extractive strongmen than civic leaders.
It's a bleak, infuriating picture. The architecture of evil was so fundamentally sound that it's still holding up the roof of poverty today.
But is there any silver lining in the data? When a population is subjected to that level of institutional failure, is there any resilience shown in the culture?
There is, and it speaks to an incredible, profound resilience of the human spirit. The researchers didn't just measure wealth and height, they also measured cultural traits, specifically social capital and trust. And they found a fascinating counterintuitive paradox.
While the formal institutions inside the concessions are significantly worse, the interpersonal culture is actually stronger.
Wait, how does that work? If your leaders are despotic and your history is trauma, wouldn't you be more isolated?
You would think so. But individuals living inside the former concession areas today report being significantly more trusting of their neighbors and other members of their community. They show higher levels of social cohesion.
Through experimental economic games played by the researchers, like dictator games and public goods games, the data proves they are much more likely to support norms of sharing income and resources with their peers.
So the people inside the historical terror zones are more cooperative. Why?
It is a remarkable, necessary cultural adaptation. When your formal institutions are completely co-opted, when your local leaders are despotic, and the overarching state is entirely predatory, who do you turn to for survival?
You have no one left but your neighbor.
You turn to your community. During the Rubber Terror, men had to form informal pacts of mutual aid just to survive the weeks in the forest. Families had to secretly share their meager food supplies when the hostage system destroyed their crops.
Over generations, this absolute necessity of relying on informal community networks solidified into deeply ingrained cultural norms of trust and redistribution. The institutions failed them, so the culture adapted to protect them.
So what does this all mean? We started this deep dive looking for the blueprint of an atrocity. And we found it in the ledgers of E.D. Morel, in the paperweight of a frustrated young duke, and in the impossible quotas of wild rubber.
It's a story of how unchecked corporate power, masked brilliantly behind a veil of philanthropy, weaponized by arbitrary borders, and accounted for in severed hands, can break the economic and institutional back of a society.
Leaving physical and economic scars that dictate a child's height and a family's wealth over a century later. But it's also a testament to how, in the face of fundamentally broken and predatory institutions, human resilience builds community as the ultimate defense mechanism.
It challenges us to think critically about the ethics of wealth, the long shadow of colonialism, and historical accountability. When we walk through beautiful European capitals, marveling at the triumphal arches and royal palaces, or when we consume highly advanced goods in the global market today, we must actively pause and ask, what invisible supply chains built this?
What human costs are hidden deep in the ledger? The architecture of evil relies on our willingness to look only at the shiny finished product and deliberately ignore the blood-stained scaffolding.
And I want to leave you, the listener, with a final provocative thought to mull over as you go about your day. Think about the physical device you are using to listen to this deep dive right now.
The Congo Free State was built on the sudden, explosive global demand for a new technology pneumatic rubber for bicycle and car tires. It turned a massive nation into a brutal labor camp for white gold.
Today, the modern Democratic Republic of Congo contains the vast majority of the world's natural reserves of coltan and cobalt. These are the essential, irreplaceable minerals powering our smartphones, our laptops, and the batteries of our electric cars.
We are currently in the middle of a new, massive global scramble for resources.
It raises a deeply uncomfortable question about the present moment.
Exactly. Are we truly so far removed from the era of King Leopold? Or have we simply outsourced the architecture of exploitation to the deeper, unseen corners of our modern supply chains?
The blueprint of extraction is still there. The ledger is still being written. We just have to choose whether or not we are brave enough to stand on the docks and look at it.